All right, we're back, and we are COMP305, week 11, lesson 11, part 1 during our broadcasts. So for this section, this is section 1, right? And for the other sections, we're going to be having our quiz on the day 2 of our section, right? Like we said last time. So it will be, for your guys, for section 1, it'll be tomorrow at 4:30. Okay, it's just letting you guys know. It's tomorrow 4:30 quiz. For the rest of us, for people who are watching and who are a part of section 2, you will have your quiz on Wednesday at 10:30. All right, so 10:30 to 12:30. Now, if somebody wants to make it from 10:30 to 12:30 and they're part of section 1, and if there's room in the room for some reason or another, I can try and accommodate, but you have to let me know ahead of time. Okay, and vice versa. If people want to do it tomorrow, but they want to be part of Wednesday. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit of review, and I also want to kind of notify you again about your final assignment, your final project, which is due, the first part of which, there's 2 parts, right? Actually, there's 3, if you think about it, right? The first part is your concept, which includes a working level, all right? A working level, first level, working, by next Friday, all right, for your final project. That is what's due, okay? And again, it's a group project. You can choose to work with a team of 2, like 1 or 2 people, or on your own, unless you get special permission otherwise. So please make sure you work with somebody. It's easier. There's quite a bit of work to be done, especially for the first part. And again, that'll be due next Friday at midnight. But I want to see it because, so let's say for next week, there is no teaching going on next week. And I know what's going to happen, right? Like I mentioned in the first class this morning. People aren't going to show up for whatever bloody reason because they think it's a free period, I don't have to come, and there's no teaching. But I'm not going to broadcast anything. There's no broadcast next week, right? So this is just me coming to class to help you out with your stuff. So it's a great opportunity because I'm going to give you feedback on your stuff, on your work. That's what I want to try doing. So I want to catch up on some of that marking stuff that I want to do with you guys, right? So actually, give you feedback directly, sit with you and say, okay, I like this, I don't like that. And also talk about your concept and who you're working with. Who's your partners, if anyone. What is your game? What are you building? So I understand. So I can redirect you if I have to. Like if you're kind of going down the wrong road, I can kind of say, hey, you know what? I don't know if this is going to work. Maybe we can try doing this, or kind of reduce the scope of work or increase the scope of work if you're not doing enough. So those kind of things is what I want to try and do with you next week. So please don't skip class. That would be very bad. All right, for next week. Some people also claim that they like working in a breakout room. It's too loud to be in a room like this, or this is too late. Some hours are weird for them, or whatever. That's up to you. But I'm giving you back again 4 hours next week and 4 hours the week after for a total of 8 hours to work on your project in class, right? So you can't say something like, "I didn't have enough time," because it's a big project. But at least if everyone works on it together. Especially if you work in class, you have time in class to work on it. And if you're with me here, I can help you out. If you got a problem, I can look at trying to solve some issues, anything like that. We can even work together to make sure that this thing is good for you, for the end of semester. So please don't skip class next week or the week after. Next week, again, concept time. That's what's due. But I want to see it before you actually hand it in on Friday, so we're good to go. And then, like I said, your quiz, again, it'd be a day 2. For you guys, it'd be on the 4:30 tomorrow for section 1, and section 2 would be 10:30 to 12:30 on Wednesday. Wow. So that's really it in a nutshell for kind of the announcement stuff. I know what's going to happen. I know traditionally people just don't come. God, you guys don't come to class when there is class. Never mind when there's no class. So it's going to be, I know it's going to be like a graveyard. I'm going to come in and it's going to be like nobody there. I'm going to hear crickets, right? But it's okay. I'm here for you. If you decide not to come, what can I do, right? So I'm going to be using that time to, like I said, to give you feedback. So today what I want to do is I want to go over the stuff we're going to test you on tomorrow, right? Which is largely around 3D, all right? Stuff around 3D that you guys already know from, have you done COMP391? A little bit of Blender. We're gonna review some of that stuff, but also how to. There's two parts. It's not the Blender piece necessarily. It's not about Blender. It's about 3D, about shaders and materials and textures and UV maps and all that stuff. but also how to bring stuff in from another program like Blender into Unity. So importing and exporting, that kind of stuff. You need to know those things because you're going to be working with other programs, and you need to know the rudiments or at a very high level of modeling, very high level. So we're going to talk about that today. So kick up your Blender. That's what we're going to start off today. We're going to do like a little bit of a Blender thing today, and then we're going to get right into Unity with importing stuff in again as just kind of a refresher of what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So let's get that going. So I'm gonna kind of pull up my Blender here, and I'm working with Blender 2.76 for people who are watching online, and you can certainly use the same one or something close to it like me. And again, some of the concepts we'll talk about today are the same ones that we talk about even with Maya or 3D Studio Max or whatever, if you have one of those. So let's talk about the notion of primitives. Okay, that's the first thing. So I've mentioned that before. So primitives would be, and I'm reviewing this again because people still were, when I talk about primitives, they don't understand what I'm saying. It's all around, the primitive shapes that we're talking about here. Like, for example, this primitive cube. This is a primitive. And to understand all the primitives that exist, and not just in Blender, but in Unity as well, if you press Shift A in Blender, you can see that all the different kind of primitives. There's planes, cubes, UV spheres and icospheres, and we'll talk about the difference of them today, just as a reminder. Cylinders and cones and toruses and all that kind of stuff. Those are all the primitives that I'm talking about here. So each time you have a primitive, an example here would be this this cube. I'm going to pull out my little keyboard here to help me with Blender right now, just because if you don't have one of these, then it becomes more challenging to use. There we go. So let's just go back to the cube. So we're looking at a cube here, and the thing with it is, what I want to do with any kind of primitive is the first thing is add a material. Okay, so remember that a primitive itself is just a shape, and what I want to do is when I set up with Blender, when I'm setting up to export from Blender or from Maya or whatever, the things to do is, first of all, we have to make the settings right. And in Blender, change the Blender game, then press the N key, make sure that we hit, like I said before, from multi-texture to GLSL, just to give us the right kind of shading. And the first thing we want to do is kind of add in a material. And if you notice on the left, you already have, because it's the default cube that gets loaded in, you have a default material that comes in, and it's called material. That's the default name. I can double click that to change the name, and I want to call that something like green, the material color that I'm going to use. And if you notice right now, there is no color, but I can choose, there's two channels here that this material has by default. There's the diffuse channel, which is basically the color and the way it takes things like light and shadow, as well as how it casts shadows. So if I was to go in here and choose, let's say, a green color, like I usually do for the cube, there it is. And also then you have your specular channel, and your specular channel, so diffuse is more like color, and your specularity is the shine, the reflectivity of your material, right? So what I want to do here again is if I click on specularity, you can see I can change the color of the specularity, but what I really want to do here is reduce the intensity. So if you make it up, the intensity becomes a lot shinier. If you bring it down, it becomes less shiny and more matte. Okay, so like no shine at all. So that's one of the properties of having a material. The other property is if I was, again, to go to the right, if you look at the last icon on the right here, and because I'm in Blender Game, if I click on this icon, you can see that I have physics attached to this object right now. I'm not going to put it on, but as I switch to Blender Game, if I scroll down, I have also a physics material that's kind of incorporated into this one. Whereas in Unity, I'd have to have a separate physics material for 3D and physics material for 2D, physics 2D material. So physic as opposed to physics. And that's what it's called in Unity. Now this is bundled with, when you switch to Blender Game, then it automatically comes with this physics material that it's by default that it adds in here. Again, when it comes to shading, right, if you notice that you can make a material that's added onto a mesh, shadeless. If I make shadeless, that means it doesn't receive light in any way. And if you notice here that we're not really seeing the effects of the shadeless or even the light and shadow properly, because our viewport, which is this little piece right here of our blender, on the bottom, you notice that we are looking at it in solid mode, and if we want to see more of a realistic shading and shadows and light casting, we want to click on material or texture. Let's click material, and you can notice now that there is additional information here. There's the shadows, right, that we're getting here. So if I click on shadeless, you'll see it glows because shadeless means that it kind of illuminates on its own. It doesn't require any light. It doesn't cast shadows. All that kind of stuff. Usually we use shadeless for things like text or things we don't want to light up or have shadows on. That's what we use shadeless for. And that's not just for Blender, but even for Unity and for Unreal and for other game engines. We use the same kind of idea. The idea of backface culling, okay, and if you notice the game setting, backface culling. So Douglas, what's backface culling?
Backface culling?
Backface culling.
You don't show the texture in the side that you don't see.
So the other side of the normal.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
The opposite side of the normal. So the normal is the side that we see. Backface culling does not render the side that you can't see because it helps us with increasing our performance for our game. That's what it's for, right? So we don't care about what's inside the walls. We can't see inside the walls, we're not going to render it. We're going to make it invisible. Now, if you notice, it's only within games, so game settings, backface culling. But with GLSL on and with shading set to GLSL, I can also turn backface culling off here in the modeler. So if I actually go in to the cube, you can see that inside my cube, it's the back face is culled, right? That's what's happened. It's not showing the back face. If I turn this on again, I can see that I can see inside the cube because this is just for modeling purposes. But in reality, you want to see something like this where the face isn't culled. And it's good to do that even when we're modeling, so that way if we somehow invert the normal, so if the normal is actually turned upside down or something, we'll see a transparent face. So it's going to help us when it comes to modeling our cube. And we saw that effect when we built our maze. Sometimes some of the faces were messed up and all this kind of stuff because what we did was I wasn't careful enough to turn backface culling on, so that way when I lifted the maze out of the plane, that's why I like to see it, then there's pieces that weren't aligned properly. So that's what backface culling is. So remember, backface culling, it's a performance enhancer because we don't render. We don't actually, produce the images on the screen, and on the other side of the face that we cannot see. We wouldn't be able to see them anyway. And usually we turn those off. We can also make things invisible as well. But those are some of the things we talk about when we talk about the material. Material is the wrapper that goes around an object, right? So you have a mesh. The material wraps around the object. It's a shrink wrap around the object that produces properties, right, like physics and light casting and shading and all that kind of stuff. Actually, it houses all the shaders and all that kind of stuff for our objects, especially in Unity. Okay, so that's one. And let's add some more objects. We'll add some more primitives here. So we need to add a few more. And by the way, you can always rename the cube. So let's say the cube was my player. I could definitely rename him here in the outliner. And again, Blender it's outliner. In Unity it's called the hierarchy. And there's different names in different programs, but more or less it's the same. Right? So just kind of an idea of what objects exist in our game world or in our scene. Okay, so this is our player. Let's just say our player cube. And I want to add other objects. I'm going to say Shift A in Blender to add another object. We'll add a plane. And notice how it bisects the cube. But what we want to do is move this plane below the cube. Right, here we go. So the plane is below the cube. And we're going to expand it by pressing the S key. So when I press the S key, then what it'll do is I can scale it up so it matches, let's say, more of my grid. There it is. And now that's one thing is, even though we've added this plane, and let's just rename the plane. So we'll say the plane now is called ground. Again, this is all review, guys, right? The plane is called ground. We want to add a new material. It doesn't have a default material on it. Let's add a new material. We're going to call this material the ground material, or we can call this brown. How about we call it brown? Because we're going to make it brown. We're going to go to the diffuse material, and we're going to kind of go into the brown spectrum here. And if you notice, we can also turn down the intensity of a material by pulling down this object here to make it a little darker than just the light brown. So it's kind of a darker brown. And now, from a specularity perspective, our ground, we don't want to make it shiny, so we just turn that specular completely off. So now it's matte. So matte or shiny. Glossy, you also might hear the term glossy, a glossy material, right? Just like if you were to pick up a ceramic cup. If you drink coffee out of a ceramic cup, it sometimes is glossy to make it, more appealing. And there's a gloss that's applied in real life to the ceramic, right? Well, here we don't want to make our ground look glossy because it'll look more like a ceramic ground, right? So we turn off specularity. Now you could choose not to do that, especially if you have a ground in your game that's tiled, like an actual tile. Let's say to mimic marble tile or something like that. Then you want to make it shiny because in real life marble tile has a shine. Even our tiles here in the school have a bit of a shine to them. So you'd have a bit of specularity on to make it more realistic. All right, so that's our kind of ground material. And I've added in a material for the ground. Let's add a sphere, and we'll talk about different kinds of spheres now. Shift A to add a new sphere. So I could certainly add in a UV sphere, which is the most common one, and I'll pull this up. You can see that as I look at the UV sphere, a generic UV sphere, you can see that here it has quite a few vertices and so on. And let me just undo that. So I'm going to say Command Z and do it again. And if I add a sphere in again, so Shift A to add the sphere in. So I'm going to add the sphere in here in Blender. Notice on the left hand side you also have some options to add things like additional rings. Right now it has 32 segments, but you can always choose more rings to make it more complex. I'm going to make that 32 rings. There we go.
So
and then, yep.
How do you add a UV sphere again?
How to add a UV sphere? So it's Shift A, and then you choose UV sphere. And as I pull my UV sphere out, you can see that now it has additional information. And if I toggle between solid mode and wireframe, I can press the Z key to toggle in and out. So there's wireframe and solid mode. Now that I moved to solid mode, I'm no longer in material, so I won't be able to see the same shaders. But sometimes what we like to do is model in a wireframe mode to help us. But you can see how more complex the sphere is compared to the cube or the plane. Plane would be a very, very simple object. And the cube is a little bit more complex because it has different sides and more the setup for the vertices and so on is different. But the sphere is very complex compared to everything else, and you would not want to model an object exactly that looks like a sphere in this configuration, especially with 32 rings and 32 segments, because it's very complex. But let's leave it like this for now, so we can see our sphere. So that's one type of sphere we can have. I'm just going to switch back. So I'm going to go Z to switch back to our object. And what I want to do here is I want to add a new material to the sphere. So we'll add a new material, and the material will be called red because we're going to name them after our materials after our colors. So we're going to say red material, and we're going to choose our diffuse, and let's make it very red. So it's very, very red. And we're also going to make our specularity very high because we want our sphere to shine like a ball, like a very smooth ball. We're not going to smooth it out right now. We're just going to keep it like this. So that's one type of sphere we can use. There's another kind of sphere, and if I press Shift A again, I can always add an icosphere, which is almost like, I'm just going to bring it up for a second, it almost looks like a 20-sided die, right? If you play D&D or whatever, icosphere is, the reason why it's called an icosphere, of course, is because it's got isosceles triangles here. And, if you notice, it has all these triangles to make up the sphere as opposed to segments and rings. It doesn't have segments and rings, right? So it's a different shape of a sphere itself, and sometimes it's a useful construct to bring in because you can make different objects with this as opposed to a sphere, which is more round. Okay, and the other option is, if I just undo, if I add in an icosphere again, so Shift A, and add in icosphere. Notice on the left now I get an option for subdivisions. So if I go with one subdivision, now it looks more of a different kind of option, right? It looks like more of a pentagonal, a hedron of sorts, right? So it's a three-dimensional shape, but more pentagonal in shape. If you look at it from one side, there's a pentagon, right? And the reason why is because it's a bunch of triangles that are linked together to make up that shape. And notice how the middle shape itself, it is another wrapper that goes around the middle, And then the bottom is another pentagon. So it's a very interesting shape. But no matter where you look at it from, what angle, there's a pentagon in different angles. And if you were to count the sides, so if I was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and again I have 1, 2, 3, so it's 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 on this side, right? And then plus 5 more, so it's like 22, 24 sides. So it's pretty good. So it's got 24 sides, you know, kind of thing, from what it looks like. And you can tell also up here where it says faces, how many faces it has, and how many triangles. There's 2,000 triangles to make this thing up. You might see it's not that many, but actually it is. And the reason why it's so many triangles, there's little triangles that make up this little thing that puts these things together. So it's much more complex than you think. Okay, let's undo that, and let's add more complexity to it. So I'm going to shift undo, and I'll say Shift A to add another icosphere again, and this time I'm going to increase the complexity to something like 8. And now when I pull this thing up, it looks perfectly round. In fact, if I press the Z key, you can't even see it because it's exactly round. It's got so much detail in here that it actually has, let me move my mouse cursor up there as well, it actually has a lot more detail than this one. Let's look at that. So I'm going to kind of delete that cube, or that sphere. I'm going to move my cursor up here so we can see it. Shift A, and I'll add an icosphere in here. And if you notice, let me just move it a little closer here so we can see it. So we're going to move it so that the shape is a little higher. Sorry, so I'm going to position my three-dimensional cursor so that way I can, when I launch my new shape, and you can see it. So if I do it again, Shift A, and I go icosphere, let's do that in icosphere. Notice how we have 8 subdivisions, and if I start bringing them down, so 7, still very close to being perfect, 6, 5, see the detail? 4, that's 4 subdivisions, 3, it's 1 higher than what's the default, 2, that's your default, 1. Right, so you see as you add detail, as you add subdivisions, and that's what you can add here, you have much more complex shapes that you can add, and you have more control because they're all triangles here than they're as opposed to rings and you know, the different kinds of shapes we have with our other spheres. Let's get rid of that so we don't care about the sphere right now. I just wanted to show you the difference between icosphere and our regular sphere. So we have like these 3 objects, right? And these 3 objects, we have our sphere, and we'll rename our sphere, and I didn't do this in first class, but we'll rename the sphere enemy, because we have our enemy object, our player object, and our ground, kind of our terrain, if you will. And so these 3 objects here are the objects that I want to wrap different textures on. Okay, so we're going to talk texture mapping. So what are textures anyway? In order for you to wrap a texture around an object, you need to have a material. You cannot add a texture to just the mesh itself, even in Unity. If you were to go to Unity and if you drag and drop a mesh, it would create a texture for you. Or drag and drop a texture, it would create a mesh, a material for the texture to hold the texture. Because you still need to know how the material is going to cast shadows, how is it going to respond to physics, all that kind of stuff is what you need with a material. So you cannot add a mesh without that. So I'm going to go to my favorite place to get meshes, or to get textures. Let's try this out. And we're going to go to cgtextures.com, which is where I like to get them. And the first texture I want to get is kind of a concrete type texture, so we'll click on the concrete texture here. And again, there's different kinds of concrete. I like the whole bunker wall idea, so I'll click on bunker wall. And there's different ones that you can see. There's painted, there's leaking, there's damage, there's all kinds of texture. We're going to click on this first one. And under the first one, you can see that there's different ones here. I'm just going to pick one that makes sense to use, so you can use any one of these. And I've already downloaded one. I'm just going to choose this one. So there's one that's a little longer, there's one that's like this. You can choose one of these. Now I've already chosen one. I've already downloaded one from this morning, so I'm just going to add it in. Now let me move from this view, which is solid view. I want to change my shading, my viewport shading, to material for a second. And you can see that there's the shading that's taking effect. So I want to select my cube, And I'm going to use the next option over. If you notice, here is the material. I want to use the third one from the right, which is texture, to select my texture. And I'm going to add a new texture to it, right? Notice how there's already a texture. The texture type is none. I want to choose image or movie if there's already something there. That came with our default material, the texture. I'm going to open a new material on the desktop, and it's going to be called Concrete Bunker 212. I'll click Open Image. Now, when I do that, it tries to wrap itself around this as best as possible. I'm going to go into Edit Mode, and I'm going to click U for Unwrap and reset it just for a second. And then I'm going to press U for Unwrap again and click Unwrap. Right? So that should give us a little bit of texture, but it's not really perfect, and we'll talk about why in a second. Like, take a look at this side here. That's not cool, right? Like, it's like elongated or stretched. And the way to fix that, of course, is to move from this view, this perspective, which is the default perspective, to UV editing mode. Now notice, again, you're back into what looks like solid mode. So you won't see your texture map here. You want to move from solid mode, you want to move into material. So you can see the material there as a preview, right? You're in editing mode, which is good, right? But here you don't see the texture because you got to click this down here and select the texture. And when you do that and you scroll back out, you can see that the texture exactly maps what you see here. That's not cool because it doesn't map it correctly, right? So how will we do that? So let's say unwrap, and we're going to reset. Okay, so once I reset my unwrap mode, I can go unwrap, and you can unwrap. There's different kinds of unwrapping you can do. When I say unwrap, I'm actually doing is I'm wrapping the texture across the material. Now, the material itself has actually, this is 6 sides of this material, right? So if I press U for unwrap, if I press Smart UV Project, right, then now you see that there are different sides of my texture over here. So if I, kind of select all, and if you notice here on the right, I got a bit of skewing here. What I want to try and do is scale this stuff up, and as I move up higher, you can see that there's going to be an effect that we're going to have here on the texture itself, right? So that it's more realistic. As I look at some of these, some of the way it's now this side in particular is a problem. So what do we do for this side? How do I know which side this is? And if I scroll back out, so you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides to it. So if I deselect all here and only select the side that I want by pressing Control Tab to go and hit Face Select mode, and select this face. So this is the face that I have for my texture. Notice how it's not on the texture itself. So I can certainly move this up, so I can move this around, right, to kind of show you how big it is. And also, it's reversed, so I can certainly rotate it if I want to, right? But again, you can see that there's very little effect that it's having on this thing, on this face at all. And why is that compared to everything else? Whereas if I look at this face, right, notice how again you have it's around the same area as well. So if I move this around, right, and I expand, right, so if I say I want to make this bigger or smaller, we should see the effect here, but we don't. Okay, there's, you see, it's like it's perfectly aligned. There's the dots, but yet on this side, we got a problem. How come? Well, let's take a look at this. So first of all, let's go back to our default mode. So here's our default mode. And we can see that our default mode has this texture applied to it. And the texture, we're going to name this Concrete Bunker. Oh. There's one other aspect of the built-in texture coordinate mapping that comes with it. Because this is the default material, the default object, which is the cube, it comes with the default material, and it also comes with the default texture. The default texture defaults to a mapping that's generated. We don't want that. We want a mapping that's a UV map. And now this changes the way this looks, as you can see. So if I go back to view UV editing mode, right, you can see now that the object has been wrapped a little differently. So if I go into editing mode and I select all, you can see how each of the objects has been mapped more or less to this particular texture. Okay, now even if they're out here, it doesn't matter. because what's happening is, if I select each one, so there's this one, and the reason why you can't see the mapping on this one is because, why? Well, there's no light. And let's add some light. So here's a point lamp. We're going to talk about lamps in a second, so I'm going to just move out from there. I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate the lamp. And I'm going to go across the x-axis here so we can see that there's a little bit more light. I'm going to add light to the scene, and that's one of the biggest problems we have if you don't light the scene properly, right? And now I'm going to zoom in on this wall, and you can see that even on this side where it didn't look so good a second ago, there's some more. Let's add some more light. So I'm going to go Shift D, and I'll move out across the y-axis so we can add a little bit of light and shadow to this side. And you know what? Let's move this just a touch this way, just so we have a little bit of light and shadow all the way around, except for maybe the bottom, which we will assume that's okay. So now the cube is well lit, as you can see, and you can see that the texture is running in different ways. This one runs this way, side to side. This one runs up and down. This one runs up and down. This one runs side to side. So how do I make these side to side ones run up and down? Anyone have an idea? I could go in here. So first of all, I'd have to select this object, tab into edit mode, select the side that I want to edit, so this one. If I can actually select, there it is, this one. And as I scroll in, you can see how it is already somewhat rotated. Let's rotate it some more. So I'm going to kind of rotate it by myself. Notice how on the right hand side you can see the preview and how I can rotate it so it matches pretty much what I have. So it's up and down. And if I can press the G button to move it around so it kind of aligns. It's not perfect by any means, but you can certainly make it as perfect as you like by spending more time. This was another one. So let's move that into view. So there's my thing into view first thing. And then rotate this again. So rotate this so that it aligns a little bit better. Because here, even though this is just a UV map, it still allows you to do all the different manipulations that you normally can do with all your models. So now they're looking pretty good. The box is all pointing up. I don't know what's on the bottom, and I really don't care. But this one's pretty good. All right, so we've got our map. Let's take a look and see what it looks like on the default. So here's our default. Now, things to note. It is very flat. Even though it's a concrete wall, it looks pretty darn ugly. So what are we going to do? We're going to add some bump to it. And the way to do that, of course, I'm just zooming in so you can see. You're going to go here to the third one still. You're going to scroll down. And on the right, you can see that there's geometry. We're going to click geometry on. Notice how that's too much. So that's way too much. You're going to see way too much bump here. So we want to turn this normal map way down by basically selecting this and going just, gives you kind of a preview, probably around anywhere between 0.1 and 0.3. And that's pretty good. It's a little bit better. So you'll see a little bit of roughness, but it's not anywhere near the insanity that it was before, right? So it kind of gives you a little bit of that concrete look and feel to it. All right. The other thing is that I notice that from a shine perspective, if I go back to my material, my specularity is pretty much up there. And I don't want my material to control my specularity here. I want my texture to control it so I can see what it looks like. So I'm going to bring this right down. And now what I want to do is I want to increase the specularity on my texture. So I'm going to go to intensity. And I'm going to kind of reduce that down so it's specular. So we see a little bit of shine. But it's not as crazy as this. Like you can see how this almost looks like very plasticky like material. If I zoom right in, you can see what I'm talking about. It almost looks like a plastic material that's happening right here. So let's turn that right down so you can see that it's going to reduce. And we got to turn it down so it's like something like 0.3, a little bit of specular, but not too crazy. So you still get a little bit of shine, you know, from everything else. Like you would normally go from a smooth, fairly smooth wall, but not as crazy as you normally would. And you see that this almost looks like a bump now, like these little holes in the wall. It's not so bad. All right, so we got our, more or less, we've got our color and our, our object, which is this cube. Now this is interesting, but it would be more interesting if we were to partition this thing even more. Like for example, if I was to go into edit mode, right? So I'm going to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to deselect all. And in edit mode, you have an option to do things like, if I select all, I can partition this object, right, by creating subdivisions, right? So let's do one more subdivision. So I've got my subdivisions here, right? So same object, more subdivisions. That's all I've added in. And I've already kind of aligned my texture, and I've done it first this time around. In the morning class, I didn't do that. Let's make one more subdivision just to be cute. So I'm going to go subdivision, number of cuts. I want to go one more. So lots of subdivisions. So now my cube is much more complex than it was before, right? And if I kind of zoom out and zoom in, or with the different kinds of, if I go from wireframe to solid, and if I go back to material, you can see that in material, if I scroll in, you can see that I still have the same pattern for my my texture. Now let's change that. So I'm going to deselect all. Same pattern for the texture. And now under select, try this. Try go and select random. Now only random portions of the cube are selected. And what I want to do here is I want to press E for extrude and press enter. So what it does is it extrudes another layer of our cube, right? But it doesn't impact the other piece. And what I want to do now is I want to press extrude, and I want to kind of, you can drag it out or put it in. So what you can do is you can add in kind of another layer of detail. But instead of extruding, I want to kind of scale. So I want to press S for scale, and I want to scale outwards. So there's some areas that I'm going to scale so that the cube looks like it's not just solid. There we go. And you can continue to do that. I mean, I've done a little bit of scaling here, so the cube isn't just perfectly flat anymore. I'm going to deselect all, right? And then I'm going to go back to select and do it another time, random, which is going to select another set of random faces, right? And I'm going to do again. I'm going to press E for extrude, enter, and then scale, and I'm going to do kind of scale in this time, so kind of push it in to kind of add another level of detail here to make my cube to make it look a little different than what it looks like before. So you can make more complex shapes, is what I'm saying, in a very, very fast way. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can go back out, and you can see that in object mode, it looks like there's some kind of concrete block, you know, whatever, an uneven concrete block I still have the texture, the concrete texture around pretty evenly, right? Because I've done the texture first and then extruded the block. So it's not so bad. And it's got some sharp edges to it and so on. Okay. We can do the same thing with our sphere. So let's do our sphere next. I'm going to kind of hit our sphere now. And we're going to add another material to the sphere. So first, or another texture. So what I want to do for the sphere is make it more woody, right? So let's go back out to CG textures, right? And I want to kind of climb out to see if I can get, it's kind of a wood plank texture to it. So click out there, way back out to this. And I'm going to go back to here to where it says wood. And there's fine wood, bamboo, ends like this, or planks. I want to click planks. Under planks, there's clean and dirty and floors and overlapping and old planks. I like the old plank look. And there's different kinds of planks you can choose. And I'm going to just choose one that makes sense to me. So something that's a little bit lighter, nothing too crazy, like this one. It's kind of a cool plank. And this is called Wood Planks Old 0153. I can download that one for today, and you can, doesn't have to be a big one. I've already done the download, so I'm going to go in here and again, you can choose a plank that makes sense for you. I'm going to click New here in my texture. So again, first of all, I got to go tab in. So notice I have my material. Here's my material. It's red. In my texture, I'm going to click New. In my texture, I know it's going to be wood plank, so I might as well just change the name. So wood plank texture, right? And in here, I'm going to click Open, and I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to click this wood plank one. Here it is, wood plank old, right? 153, and click Open. And now I have my texture. Here it is, right? Now I can try and unwrap this thing around my my sphere. So let's just zoom in here, and I have to be in edit mode to unwrap, by the way, guys. If I click U for unwrap and click unwrap, I have a little bit of that unwrapping happening. And for me to check it, I'm going to go back to change my perspective to UV editing mode, right? And I don't want to look at my cube anymore. I want to look at my sphere. Here it is, right? Here's my sphere. And yeah, my keyboard might finally be dead. I may have to charge this thing. Maybe not. I don't know. There we are. So I want to zoom in on my sphere. And my sphere is cool and all, but what I want to do is change my material from concrete to wood, right? And like I said, you can see how it's fully selected. But when I unwrapped, it looks like it's all unwrapped in here. It's kind of looking weird, right? So let's unwrap again. and do a smart UV unwrap and click OK. When I do that, you get a bit of different kind of unwrapping going on, where it's more this way. This is okay. Let's see what the effect is on the cube though. It kind of makes it look like it's more smooth, almost like the wood has been polished and kind of added to different parts of the sphere. It's okay. I'm not totally impressed by this by this pattern, but it's not totally bad either. I can live with it. Now it's too big, so I want to make it larger. So I'm going to click on. Whenever you move your mouse to control both sides of the UV editing window, when you're on the right side, you control the right side. When you're on the left side, you control the left side. So my mouse on the left side now, I'm going to press S for scale, and I'm going to move this way higher so that the pieces are smaller, right? So I want the pieces to overlap a lot more and be smaller, right? So that way I can see some of the planks, and they're all going to be mixed up anyway, right? And you'll see the effect in a second. So if I deselect all, here I'm moving my mouse to the right, deselect all, you can see that some of the planks now, I've got this kind of woody feel to it, but it's very shiny. That's one thing. I mean, I try to make it shiny. It's very shiny and it's very smooth, and I don't want that. So how do I change that? Again, I go back to my default view. Here's my sphere. And again, it's hard to see what it really looks like until I have a better light source. I'm going to kind of tab out, move it to the light, move it to the middle into the light like I want to see. And you can see how bright and specular this thing is, right? So I'm going to move back into material and change my specularity so it's way down, so I can control it with my texture. So I'm going to move the specularity way down, so now it's matte. And I'm going to go into my texture, and under texture, I'm going to add in my geometry. Now, this is where it gets a little bit crazy, because if I go here now, it looks like it's really like wood planks in some places. There it is. Look, take a look. It's kind of a weird wood, like wrapped around. It's like almost like a magician took some wood and wrapped it around the sphere, right? So it's kind of cool. It's a little bit too bumpy for me, for my liking. If I like really focus right in there to see what it looks like, you can see how it's very bumpy, right? So again, I don't want to. I think it's too much myself. I'm just going to press the N button here. And what I want to try and do is reduce this a lot. So I'm going to probably bring it down to about, nothing negative, but about 0.3, maybe even lower, maybe like 0.1. I'm just going to type it in. So, you know, again, it's going to be 0.1. 0.1. Notice how it's a lot nicer now. Okay, good. And I want to add in shade, specular, right? But not so much. This looks like it's made of plastic again. So I'm going to bring that specularity ray down. And until there's a bit of shine on the wood, but not very much. Like again, something like a 0.1 would be fine. So again, 0.1. So it's got a little bit of shine, but nothing good. So it's more like a realistic material. There we go. Okay, so now we've seen this piece, but we're not quite done, right? We want to do kind of what we did with the cube. We're gonna do some random stuff here. So we're gonna tab in. We're gonna deselect all. So you can here's select all. There's deselect all. We're gonna go to the select menu. We're gonna click random. Not right clicks random faces. We'll do the same thing. We'll press E for extrude, enter, right? And we're gonna press S for scale, and we'll scale outwards. So the cube is, or the sphere is going to have these weird faces here like this. Right? It looks very, again, woody, but planky. Now, it's going to affect the way our object looks a lot. Okay, cool. Let's do that again. So deselect all, right? And then what I'll do is I will do random selection again, just to make it so it's interesting, so you can see a different shape. Random, and we'll say E for extrude, enter. This time we'll press S and we'll scale in. So some areas are even messed up even more. There we go. So it kind of looks like this. So irregular. So some irregularities that came out. Cool. And if you don't like that, like there's some places that stick up like this, like these little places here, right, as an example. You could always go and modify them yourself if you wanted. But I'm going to leave them as is, just to give it a little bit of, weirdness to the whole thing, and to show you what the effect is of the texture across the material. It's not bad. It looks pretty good. And again, there's ways of improving this, and changing what it looks like. It looks almost like it's been carved out of wood, right? Like actually chopped up or whatever. That's pretty cool. Almost. Okay, cool. So let's just zoom out here. So that's that. And of course, we have one more to do, or two more to do actually. There's the ground. So I'm going to kind of tab out into edit mode. And now this one, I want to make the ground have its own pattern, right? This own material or texture. So let's try that. So we're going to go back out to CG textures. And I want to go out a couple times where I want to go, and I want to get this soil that's cracked up like this, right? It's cracked up soil. It almost looks like, someplace in Bolivia, like I mentioned earlier. So let's click cracked and choose one that makes sense, for you. Probably one of these that makes sense. So I guess I'll choose something like this. So this is soil cracked 103. You can choose one of these. I've already downloaded this thing. So let's add that in. So I'm going to go new. And I'm going to go, so call it soil cracked. Click open, go to desktop, and go to soil cracked. It's actually soil cracked 146 that I chose. There it is. Now you can see that I'm not really seeing anything there. And again, I got to go into edit mode for that, unwrap, and click unwrap. Now you notice that it's there, but it's massive, right? So there's what it looks like. So you could definitely leave it like that if you wanted these big cracks in the ground. But I want it to scale down a little bit. So again, I'm going to go back into the other perspective, which is UV editing mode, and click this little button here to select that texture, which is the soil crack. There it is. Notice how they're the same size, right? I don't want them to be the same size, and I want them to be a lot smaller. So I'm going to press S for scale on the left side, and now I will kind of pull this out until they tile a little bit more. There we go. About that. Again, I just did that by eye, but you could certainly measure it if you wanted to. Okay, cool. Let's do the same trick with this one. So I'm going to go back to default view, and here's the cracked ground. I'm going to go back into my texture here. Oops, down here, and there's a couple of things I need to change. One is the geometry. So I'm going to go back in here. Now that's way too much for me. Now some people might like that. I don't. So again, if I was going to press the number button here, I'm going to show you this thing a little bit closer. You can see that this is way too bumpy for me. It actually takes away from the look of things as opposed to adding it for me. So if I reduce this, you can see as I start reducing, you get a bit of a preview until you can see the bump. And again, it looks like something between 0.1, maybe less than 0.1. So again, let's try 0.1. So 0.1, maybe even less. So like maybe in this particular case, I went a little higher this morning, but maybe what I want to do is 0.05. That's so you get a bit of texture, but very little. It's a little bit of a bump, right? So you see a little bit of bumpiness to it. Looks more realistic. Don't have a lot of shine. Let's add some specularity to it. That looks way too plasticky. And there's also some artifacts going on. Like as you go closer to the actual look, it looks like it's very pixelated. So what I want to do is I want to reduce that a lot. So it kind of reduces so that there's a bit of shine. Again, probably in the 0.2, 0.3 range. It makes more realistic looking, right? The ground, but not so bad as it was before. Okay, so that's kind of it for those ones. So kind of a few textures, and again, we're reviewing a couple of things. It's not about texture mapping, but a couple things to review here. So there's the mesh itself. It's wrapped with a material. The material produces a container for the shaders, for the physics that it has on it, the way it casts shadows and receives light and so on. And then as well as it's also a container for the texture map that we can layer on top of it. Let's do one more that's a little bit different this time than we would do. So typically we want to add in one more, so I'm going to say Shift A. I'm going to add in a plane. Here's my plane. And I'm going to rotate it across the x-axis by pressing R and X afterwards. 90 degrees by pressing 90. There it is. And what I want to do is put this over here. Right, so there's my plane. And what I want to do here with this one, and I got to make sure that I'm looking at, this is the normal where the arrow comes away from it, right? When the arrow comes perpendicular out of the object, that's the normal. Yep, the opposite side will be culled. We won't see anything. I want to put a door on this thing. I want to put like kind of like a futuristic door. And let's go and look for one. So I'm going to go back here again, and I'll say something like this. Let's say some kind of futuristic, you know, door, right? And then I'll say, you know, from an image perspective, see if I can find one. And there's tons, right? So if you look at images for futuristic door, you can see ones like this one. This is the one I picked from this morning. So let's just choose this one. Notice how it says loading dock. And I'm gonna download this one, this image, right? So there's a bunch of other ones, by the way, futuristic doors. So you can do it this way as well. Download a futuristic door, and I want to apply it to this this object here and make it a little bit larger, right? So the object isn't large enough. So first of all, I can reshape it. So again, I'm gonna kind of right click, kind of scale it up a little bit more, right? So, and pull it down so it kind of connects with the ground. There we go. So there's where my futuristic door is going to go, let's say. And I want to, on top of this, I want to layer this this object. So a couple things I need to do here. One, and by the way, notice how I have my ground selected. So I have my ground selected here, and I got this futuristic door here, right? What's going on with the futuristic door? Is this futuristic door part of my ground? It actually is. It's part of the same object. Because I'm in edit mode and I added it in edit mode, it's the same object. To separate it, I need to press the P button. So P, which separates my selection. Now you see that the ground and this futuristic door object, it's also called ground 1. So rename this to door. It's a separate object now. And what I want to do with this one is it also has because I took it from here, it also has the soil cracked, and it also has the brown material, which I don't want. So I'm going to kind of delete that brown material from this one. And I'm also going to, because I've done that, there's no more material that's on here. So I want to add a new material that I want to call door. And I'm going to turn the specularity way off for this one. I'll control the specularity here. Again, if I was going to go into just to see a solid shape, look what I'm seeing. Well, there's the normal. Right? Remember I told you about the normal? This normal, this side is called, and this side is not. Right? So if I was actually going to manipulate the normal, right, on this one, and select it, notice how it's way over here. How come? Because when I select this thing, this is part of the ground, right? So what I'd like to try and do is, and also my normal's messed up. Like you notice the arrow is this way, but it's supposed to be this way. So you know what? I want to start over because I don't want to make a mistake. So let's just do that again. So I'm going to go back to Shift A, add a plane, in object mode this time. Rotate on the x-axis 90 degrees. There we go. And you know, again, I can see that the normal is where it is. So I can see the shape of it. There we go. And I've rotated it in a certain way. That's why it looks the way it is. If I rotate it minus 90, so if I undo, and undo, and rotate across the x-axis minus 90, you can see that the normal, which I didn't do in the morning class, the normal and the arrow is pointing in the same direction, which is what I want. I don't want it to be the other way around. Because if it's the other way around, that means the arrow is pointing this way, but my normal is actually back this way. It's not good. All right, so I want to do it this way. So the normal is perpendicular to the where the arrow is perpendicular to the normal. All right, let's add a material. So add a material. We're going to call this door, like I said, and then change the material from fully spec or half specular to nothing, and then add a texture. What I'm going to add a new texture, which I'm going to call futuristic door or loading dock door. Loading door, let's say. And then press open, and I'm going to choose that loading dock door object, which is going to be here under futuristic metallic door gate. All right, cool. And I've loaded it, but I haven't unwrapped it. So I'm going to go tab into edit mode, unwrap, and then click unwrap. And I don't see anything. How come? How come? Well, we gotta see why I don't see anything. And remember that the default material type down here when we wrap is generated. This is UV. We don't have a UV map. Let's go into UV editing mode to see what I got. Okay, so there's my material I'm looking at now. I don't want that. I want my futuristic door. There it is. And let's zoom into that material by clicking the button there, and I can see that it is there, right? But there's a couple of issues. What do you see as the issues? It's flat, but it's also that too, and it's also upside down. See, the door is upside down. Even though it's like this, it's the way that I've added things in. The way I rotated it upside down when I rotated the material, so my orientation is rotated as well. So let's try that. So I'm going to say rotate across the x-axis, and again I can rotate it exactly with 180 degrees, but I'll just do it by eye this time around. So kind of like that. And now that I've done that, I can crop it, and I can deselect all. I can use B-select mode to select this side, right? And then I can press G across the x-axis and then pull this in a little bit so I can crop the image so it's as close to it as the door as I can get. Yeah, so that's pretty good. So that's a pretty good door. Now the proportions are a little wrong. Notice how this is way wider than this, right? And the reason for that is because the way I've done this thing, so I can fix that by, on this side now, I can choose the scale, or I can pull it in. So let's try pulling it in. So I'm going to say deselect all, right? B-select mode, select the side, right? And you know, again, I have to be inside of vertex mode. Try that again. Vertex mode. To do that, I can choose this vertex and that vertex as well by selecting this side. And what I can do is, again, I can pull it in so that it looks more proportional by just chunking it in a little bit. And just by eye, I'm just looking at it by eye. If I want to see it in direct proportions, I could choose, not that one, Shift, no, Control, there we go. So that's kind of, that's the back perspective, and I could choose orthographic mode to really look at it and see if it matches up with the proportions that I have here in this door. It's not bad. So I've got this piece right here. Okay, cool. So I've kind of layered the texture. You notice the techniques I used for this one. What I did was I cropped it by, when I highlight the entire thing, you can notice how this part only has this because there's extra information here that I don't care for, right? Like on this side here, I don't care for that information. And I rotated it because it was upside down, right? So I've done those two things. Let's go back into default mode for a second. So I've got my door, and I got to look at it and change modes to material mode to see it. There it is. It's floating up and down. I can now scale it because it's in the right proportions. Because if I move it down, you can see that it's quite small, right? So let's scale it up in proportion to my other objects, right? So now when I move in, there's my door. Like almost like a docking door, right? And what I can do with it is I can use this the same way I did the other pieces. So I can kind of move in, and as I do that, I want to change my, because it looks pretty flat, looks like an image, right? I want to change my properties here by going into geometry, clicking the normal, but that's a little bit too much for me, right? Because it almost makes it look like it's made of rock as opposed to metal, right? And I want to reduce that again, like way down to like something like 0.1. Gives a little bit of depth or faux depth. And again, this is just an image that came off the internet. It's not perfect. But you certainly could make this more complex, right? By cutting it out and so on. And so make it a real door. Like if you want to make this door open up, you'd have to basically cut it out. You'd have to cut the door. So this piece here, there's two separate pieces, 1, 2. And then you can make a little animation so that maybe you would push in and then slide out like this, one of those kind of doors, right? And you could also add depth to the door, right? So the door right now is very flat, right? Even if you look at it from the side, right? But you could make it so that it's more of a door with depth, and you can make these pieces separate. Okay, but for now it's all one. I also want to make this door a little bit more metallic looking, so I'm going to add some more specularity here. So that's a lot of specularity. That's 100% specular. I don't know if I want to make it that shiny, because now it looks, like I said, almost plastic. So, but I do want more than normal. So I kind of pull this down to about, oh, that's the color, sorry. I want this more than normal. So let's pull it down to about, 0.3 to 0.4. There we go. So some specularity on it when there's stuff. Notice the back is invisible. Back face color. All right, so we have our objects, and let's save this thing. So there's a couple ways we can do this. I'm going to say File, Save, and it's going to ask me, of course, for where. I'm going to put it on my desktop, and I'm going to call this, just like I did in the morning class or the earlier class. I'm going to delete this piece, and we'll call it, kind of door and other objects, and we'll just save it. Now, there's some stuff we missed, and I'll talk about this. One is I click the End button, and I want to do a couple things. One is I've got this piece here, right? So this is all good. This is all set up properly. But the other piece is there's a third object, the third icon from the left, right? If I click that, notice that the scale is none, which means it's in Blender units. Blender units in Unity don't match, right? Blender units are Blender units. Unity uses metric, which is meters, so I got to click metric. That's one thing. So now everything's in meters. That's important because when it comes in Unity, it'll come across in meters as well. That's one. The other thing is that my materials, if I click on my objects now, so if I click on my enemy and I go to my texture, it's there, but what I want to do is I want to bundle it along with Blender, so click on this button. If I can. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. Click on this, follow materials. I don't care about my lamps, I'm not going to import them. Definitely click this one, and my player, click that one. Alright, so I've got all my materials, and I've got all my objects. Let's save it again. So save, which saves the Blender file. And I want to open Unity now, but before I do that, let's take a short break, 5 or 10 minutes to get some air and a little bit of washroom break, and then I'll come back and we'll import everything into Unity. We'll review what we talked about.